Right, what we'll do. Right, we'll get started. So anybody who's still coming in now, they're only going to miss my introduction, so they won't miss any of our expert analysis from our panel. Okay, so good morning. It's good to see so many of you joining us to hear analysis from our experts on what life might be like following a change of government. My name's Tim Stowell, and I'm one of the tax partners at Moore Kingston Smith. I'm sure most of you are familiar, as I can see lots of regular names on the attendee list. However, for those of you who don't know us so well, Moore Kingston Smith is a top 10 audit, tax and advisory firm working with businesses across all industries, not-for-profit organisations as well as private clients. We're also part of More Global, an international network with presence in over 100 countries. So with the general election drawing closer, the main parties are starting to drip feed their plans for the next few years if they're in power. The Conservatives surprised us all in the budget with a reform of the non-dom tax regime, and they made a big spending commitment shaving 2% of national insurance. More surprises are likely to come, as it sounds like there are plans for another budget before the election. The Labour Party have only really given commitments in relation to changes to the taxation of independent schools, their own reform of the non-dom rules and a strengthening of employee rights. As ever, the devil's in the details, so I'm delighted to be joined by my colleagues Donal Moon, Michelle Denny-West and David Mitchell. Donal will be covering all things relating to employment law, Michelle will be covering tax, and David will run through areas relating to financial planning and pensions. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A rather than the chat, and I'll try and weave those into the presentation. And any that we don't get a chance to answer in the session will be answered by email afterwards. The session's being recorded, and the recording will be shared in the next day or so as we pull everything together. So with the scene set, I'm going to hand over to Donal. So we're going to start on employment law and what that means for employees and employers. I think just to start with, as it's the area that I think from the Labour Party perspective at least, which if there's a change of government, they might be the ones in control. I think it's the area that's probably had the least publicity. So what are Labour's plans for employment law?
Thank you, Tim. So yeah, this is quite interesting. So Labour has published a green paper called A New Deal for Working People, setting out its vision for what it intends to do with employment law. I think it's fair to say, looking at some of the contents, that we can expect quite a radical paradigm shift from a kind of balanced employment law situation to perhaps moving towards more worker and employee friendly rights. But just to kind of put this in some context, Angela Rayner, who's the deputy leader, made a cast iron pledge at the TUC conference last year that a new employment rights bill would be brought in within 100 days of a Labour government assuming office, if indeed they're successful. So quite a few things to unpack here, quite some very interesting proposals. So the first is a minimum wage that people can actually live on. So we don't know what that is. There's been no figures set out for obvious reasons, that they'll need to look at the books first to see what's possible, I should think. But I think looking at the language that's being used, I think we could probably expect a significant increase from where we are now. I think we can expect to see more pro-union legislation, certainly removing that requirement that the current government has to keep minimum service levels during strike action or industrial action. I think that we could see that go, and possibly making it easier for unions to go into workplaces and organise and be recognised as a trade union for a greater pool of workers than is currently the case. And the introduction of something quite interesting called sectoral collective bargaining. So fair pay agreements. So at the moment, most collective agreements will be organised on an individual company or organisation employee basis. But the proposal here is to apply this to whole sectors. We don't know what sectors yet, but I'm suspecting things like education, third sector such as charities would be in the scope at the very least. They're proposing a single enforcement body to enforce workers' rights. So that's quite in line with what we saw with the Brexit withdrawal agreement, really, that there has to be some kind of single enforcement body. But this one will have teeth. It will be able to go into workplaces and investigate and potentially bring prosecutions or civil actions for breaches of certain things like national minimum wage, worker exploitation cases, and potentially discrimination as well. There'll be a total ban on two things. So this was quite surprising to me. But number one is 0 hours contracts. So at the moment they're perfectly legal, but the exclusivity clauses are not. This would now be a total ban on those. In fairness, we never tell people to use them. We usually say use casual workers agreements instead, because they receive such bad press over the years. But yeah, we can expect to see those outlawed, I think. And the other practice of fire and rehire. That's quite interesting because yeah, it received a lot of bad press after some high-profile companies dismissed workers and then re-engaged them on worse terms and conditions. And so it's unsurprising this has come under fire. The current government's approach has been you can do it as long as you consult properly, and we'll issue you a statutory set of guidelines that you must follow. Labour is saying that they're going to completely outlaw the practice, and they're going to go as far as amending the unfair dismissal legislation to do it. So that's quite an interesting approach. I don't know where that would leave employers if they do get into this situation, but I guess tying back to the union point, it may be that the focus will the employer's expected focus will shift heavier to trying to get agreement rather than fire and rehire. But again, we'll have to see what the legislation is, how the legislation is actually worded. Labour proposes to reform employment status. So at the moment, we've got 3 employment statuses we have to take care of to think about. So employees with all the rights, self-employed contractors with very little rights, if any, and a halfway house of worker with some of the rights. What's being proposed is to merge employer and employee into one status of worker and give that status of worker all the rights, including the right to bring unfair dismissal claims. So that's quite interesting. That will widen the pool of people who have full rights to an ever greater pool of people.
And the bit that the press seem to have picked up on already, Donald, is the idea of day one rights. So in the context of unfair dismissal, what does day one rights mean?
So, in theory, it would mean that you could be employed at 9 o'clock on a Monday and bring a claim by 10 o'clock on a Monday. Extreme example, but that's what could happen if someone comes to your work and they're not suitable by any stretch of the imagination, because they're either a poor performer or poor appearance or poor conduct, and you have to make a snap decision to dismiss that person. Will now,
and that's a shift from, what is it now, 2 years?
2 years, yeah. I mean, I think the lowest it's ever been is 26 weeks. And even that was seen as extreme then, and then it was extended and extended. So,
yeah. I mean, that's likely to lead to more employment tribunal cases. I mean, just anecdotally, the employment tribunal is fairly clogged up at the moment. So more cases brings the system to a grounding halt, presumably.
Yeah, well, I think that's an issue, certainly. I mean, I was at a case recently, and we've been listed for the final case has been listed for 2025, or the latter half. So I think if we widen the pool of people who can bring claims, certainly you can expect to see more people trying to bring claims. I think that's inevitable, really. Therefore, longer waiting lists for tribunals to be able to hear cases.
And I think the other area that the press picked up on, they always go for the sort of the easy bite-sized stuff. It's the right to disconnect. So the idea that I was skiing a couple of weeks ago, and in the queue for the lifts, people were still on their phones doing their work emails while they had a spare 5 minutes. So going forward, what does the right to disconnect mean?
So it will give him, yeah, that's an interesting one. It will give the employee the right to switch off and not have to accept phone calls and emails from or WhatsApp messages from their workplace after hours and during holidays. Quite an interesting one though, because one of the debates that's often takes place is, well, will this mean that as an employer we can't contact our employees in the case of an emergency? There's several countries that have brought this in now, and what I'm noticing in all of them is that they are broadly speaking taking a sensible view and saying there are situations where it's unavoidable, and that won't be a breach of the legislation to do that. So I think one can only hope that there will be some reasonableness built into the legislation. Of course, we'll have to see what it is. But if every other country's version of this is anything to go by, then yes, it probably, I'd be surprised if there wasn't some provision for them to allow emergency situations to be covered.
I mean, there'll be on this webinar, there'll be people representing employers, and there'll be employees. It's hard to argue against some strengthening of employment rights and increases to minimum wage, especially in sectors like farming and hospitality, I suppose, where the very rock bottom salaries are paid. But this is a lot for employers to take in, and could come in fairly soon after the election if there is a change of government. What have the conversations you've been having with your clients, with employers particularly, what are you suggesting they do to prepare for all of this?
Well, there's a few things I'm kind of suggesting that they could do. of course, there's a limit to what can be done, I suppose, because we don't know what the legislation will look like. I'm seeing lots of rumours flying about in the news about, okay, maybe some things will be watered down, maybe some things will be coming in as they are. So we'll have to wait and see, I think, how this actually pans out. But I think the first one probably goes without saying. I'm just saying, look, keep abreast of the news. Well, obviously, we keep our clients abreast of the news. But if they haven't us as a resource, ensure that your business leaders and managers are watching the news. Those can be really valuable sources of what's going on out there, what conversations are taking place, and therefore whether you're ultimately likely to be looking at the worst case scenario in terms of more liabilities, or whether you're looking at what potentially a watered down version of it. I think that's helpful to just keep abreast of all of that. I think one thing I would say is that if unfair dismissal becomes a day one right, then process will accrue much greater importance than it possibly has now, whereas some employers might be tempted to take a laissez-faire approach to things like disciplinaries, where you've got an employee with short service because they don't necessarily have to follow a full procedure. That sort of stuff will become super important. So and other processes as well, which are fertile ground for disputes, such as grievances, whistleblowing procedures. So why not take the opportunity to double check that your managers are well trained and comfortable in handling these things, and make them aware of the importance that this could accrue. And if you feel that there's any gaps, perhaps fill it with training. Make sure they're ready now, so that you don't have to react at the last minute when they come in.
We can only crystal ball gaze and say when the election is, but it feels like it's October, November now, rather than a May election. I think that's been ruled out. If it's coming in with 100 days, we're really talking about the beginning of next financial year, I guess, sort of April, May time, March, April, May. So that's the time to get things in order. I mean, the debate you and I have had over the months where we've been reading this is, if you've got poor performing employees now that you really know you need to do something about, and you're counting down your 2 years as to when you need to grasp the nettle, you might find that even though you might think you've got a year, 18 months left by the time the election, that could shrink to 1 day overnight. So, I mean, as ever, regardless of the election and changes, if you've got poor performing employees, putting them in a process now so you can exit them from the business, if that's the right answer under the current rules, feels better. Do you think there'll be a rush for people to do that? Will people be looking at their head count and deciding whether there are people they really ought to be addressing?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, really, employers should be dealing with situations as and when they occur anyway, and not sort of banging their heads at the sand, because it always leads to trouble down the line, and then you'd end up with the inevitable race against time to try and sort of end employment before the person in 2 years. But yeah, absolutely. I think if there are any issues in there, it might be advisable to deal with them now rather than waiting till potentially it becomes more difficult after the election to take action.
So we'll move on a second. We just have one question in from the attendees. So we're a hospitality location business and need casual staff for client events. We use both 0 hours contracts and agency staff. How will each of these groups be impacted by the expected employment law changes? Well, I guess 0 hours contracts might be over.
Yeah, I think that could well be the case. Employers who use 0 hour contractors may have to find some other means of engaging staff that's compliant with the law. So you'll either have self-employed contractors. That would seem like the most logical one, because it sounds like if you're using 0 hours contractors, you're looking for flexibility. So that might be the possibility. Make sure that they're genuine contractors.
And agency staff, I don't think there'll be any changes to agency staff, other than probably more focus on that sector, because I know the government have always shown interest in how compliant agency workers are.
Yeah, certainly. And if we're going to create one category of workers, that will probably hook in agency workers anyway. So it could well mean that those people become employees with the full range of rights. In some cases, that's already the case because they're employed by the employment agency, but not.
Yeah. So that type of business that is exactly the types of business that the Labour Green Paper. Do have a read. If you can't find it, drop us a line and we'll send you the link to it. But do have a read. It could heavily impact your business, and you need to watch this space between now and the election. Right, Donal, I'm sure we'll come back to you. I think it's a fascinating topic, what might happen with employment rights. We're going to move on to tax. So Michelle, I think I'm going to move around from the. Well, no, let's stay in the order we discussed earlier, rather than keep you on your toes. So in the recent budget, the surprise we had, and I think it was a political masterstroke, but we're not going to do politics in this session. But the surprise we had was Conservatives sort of stole Labour's thunder and actually abolished the non-dom regime, or reforming it ahead of Labour getting to do it if they were to get in power. So we've got what we think is the new regime. We've got some details. Do you think there'll be any more changes, as this was originally a Labour idea, if there's a change of government?
I think almost certainly there'll be some more changes, partly because of what you've just mentioned, in that actually the Conservatives did steal Labour's thunder. But again, we're not here to talk about politics. But I think there will be changes also in the practical sense, because what's become very evident, again, for those who are a bit more aware of the detail, is that there's some unintended consequences of these rules. So I think there'll be like transitional provisions that are coming in may all be slightly different, but as a whole, I think the main policy will be as it's been announced. But it will just be, the detail, as it always is. The devil will be in the detail. I mean, I think one big thing that will be looked at, and again, there's a big appetite at the moment for growth and investment in the UK, and where this has been heavily criticised is this change to the non-dom regime. It's very much like, are we putting off people coming to the UK? That attractiveness, is it suddenly gone? So, and given that other countries not too far away from the UK have very, very, very beneficial regimes for non-doms, I think there will be changes in this area to make sure that actually trying to keep existing non-doms here, but also to try and increase their attractiveness again in the UK, because we've had a lot of bad press over it, and I think there just has to be something around that personally.
So under the Conservative announcement, individuals sort of overseas origin can come and work in the UK, or live and work in the UK for up to 4 years, and have a pretty beneficial tax status over those 4 years. But after that, they're taxed just like everybody else. That 4-year period, I mean, although Labour talked about abolishing the non-dom regime, I think everybody always expected it to be a shortened period. Do you think Labour will sort of stick around the 4 years?
I think personally that'll get slightly extended, but again, that's very much a personal viewpoint more than anything else. Just because I think they have to be seen to be listening to the concerns that have been raised, and actually what's been announced at the moment, it hasn't really given them too far to go, because they've Conservatives have said we're going to abolish it, and Labour, because it was very much one of their policies, they had to say if they come into power, this is something they would do. I just think maybe they'll just be a bit more sympathetic and try to appease some of the concerns that are out there.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, the politics of it all, which we shan't get too lost in, by the Conservatives spending the money that's being raised by abolishing the non-dom regime, it does mean the Labour Party need to look elsewhere to raise money. So when we get to David later, we'll talk about whether pensions are fair game. But let's move on then to the independent schooling system. So this is the one that's really been a worry for our clients for a long time, because Labour really only had two key policies: abolishing the non-dom regime and changing the taxation of independent schools, in particular putting VAT on school fees. This looks fairly certain. So how are you seeing parents react to this amongst our client base?
Yeah, I mean, parents are really concerned, because obviously clearly what they're worried about is suddenly their school fees are going to go up by 20%. Whilst I think it's almost certain that if Labour come into power, there will be VAT on school fees, we don't know at the moment, first of all, what that rate will be. It may well not be the full 20%. There could be a reduced rate there. But again, that's not taken away from the fact that, private schooling is going to cost a lot more for our clients. And so we're having a lot of people asking about if there's any planning they can do. And again, those who are affected by this would have heard about the possible prepayment schemes that are in place. So those who've got some cash that's available, it's sort of being suggested that you prepay school fees ahead of time. And again, our view as a whole at the moment, I think, is that this is unlikely to work. However, if you do have cash available, then it's worth considering, provided it is done properly and you are very much aware of the risks, because I think it's one of those things where if you put money into a school, obviously that cash is being tied up for a period of time. You could have earned money elsewhere, because I think we were running some numbers earlier, and I think if you're able to get, like, say, a 5% compound interest rate, actually that, if it is a 20% VAT rate, you're getting that saving back through a return on your money anyway. So it does need some thought. And also there's that credit risk that you're putting money into a school that actually it's no guarantees they will be around in time. And I think as well, we need to think about the practical side of things, actually, when this may well come in. Because I think, as Tim alluded to earlier, it's likely to be a general election will be towards the end of the year. And it's highly unlikely that if VAT starts to be charged on school fees. It's not going to happen partway through a school year because that would just be nonsensical. So the earliest we're likely to see this is from September next year, so September 25. So again, if you are starting to prepay and you're taking that risk with your cash, it's like, the earliest you're going to get the benefit from it is September 2025. So again, it's quite a long lead time on that. So it's just, you need to have to step back and start thinking about what needs to be done, the planning around there.
Yeah, I mean, schools have operated prepayment schools for as long as I can remember, but the prepayment, the discount on school fees tends to be relatively low.
Yeah.
And with in almost not quite living memory, but in recent years, I sit in the dark for a second. In recent years, because you can actually get a decent return on your money, you've got to do the spreadsheet to see whether the 2 or 3% discount in school fees versus being able to actually earn some money on cash deposits, whether that makes sense. So there's the worst thing that can ever happen to a tax planning idea is it starts being run in the FT and the Times. So they've all run stories about prepayment of school fees. So it's very much in Labour's sights that if they do get in, the general expectation is either they'll rely on existing case law precedent that says these sort of things generally don't work in VAT terms, or they'll introduce some sort of anti-forestalling rules that will just stop it working. So we'll wait and see. Probably the less it's talked about in the press, the more likely it is that people will actually be able to prepay school fees, and it will help them save some VAT.
Yeah, I think it goes back to something David was saying earlier as well about when we were having a conversation before this, is that if parents are planning on prepaying school fees anyway, that's probably a no-brainer. If because there was some sort of incentive, then go ahead and do it. But actually, it's not necessarily worth taking the risk because, again, our view is that it's probably not likely to work in the longer term.
And I suppose the downside is that you have to pay, you've prepaid your school fees, but you'll need to pay the 20% on top later. So
yeah,
if that's going to be unaffordable, it's a really difficult decision to think about parking some money with the school. Yeah. So I mean that was one of Labour's policies. Conservatives, of course, didn't steal Labour's thunder and implement that, as that's very, very sort of anti-conservative policy, and they've been pretty critical of how successful the policy will be. But we'll wait and see. If it feels certain if Labour do come in. The other area of tax that had lots of discussion, particularly in the way into the budget, and seems to animate the population, is inheritance tax. So although we wonder whether there'll be any reforming of inheritance tax in the budget just gone, as that's a vote winner as far as what people are generally concerned about, it was left alone in the budget. So do you think, well, two questions. One, if the Conservative Party do have another budget pre-election, will they do anything? And if they don't, or even if they do, what do you think Labour will do post-election if they get into power?
Yeah, see, IHT is a very interesting one. I think, as you say, it's a very emotive tax. It's something that's been a lot, people feel very strongly about this. So if the Conservatives have another budget, I sort of still sense they probably, if they do something, it'll be something very, I suppose, very much about vote winning, about benefiting a big group of people very quickly. Because I think if we remember that when IHT was first introduced in its current form, it was actually only really intended to affect the very wealthy. But because of the way, particularly house prices have gone, when it's now taking, I suppose, what people are calling, normal families, like hardworking families, into the scope of inheritance tax, and that's why it's become so emotive, even though it still doesn't affect that many people really, and doesn't collect that much money. I think it would be a bit of a no-brainer to do something about that if Conservative were to have another budget. But again, I don't think they'd go for a massive reform. However, if Labour were to come in, obviously something they have sort of commented on about what they would do here, and I do think they would look to do something, because again, it's one of the policies they have said they would look at this. This is something that does need to be addressed and dealt with, actually, to make it a bit more fit for purpose and to deal with it. What's very difficult is because it doesn't raise that much money. It's like you say, they can probably appease a lot of people quite quickly, say just by raising the thresholds. It doesn't need to be massive changes. And we've seen previously that there was a lot of calls, again, back when the Office of Tax Simplification existed before they were disbanded, that they recommended a reform to IHT and capital gains tax all at the same time. And so what I expect to see at some point in the future is there will be a big reform, probably again following a change of government, where both of those taxes will be looked at and the reform will go hand in hand. Because I do think if there's a change to IHT, that you talk, give them with one hand, but you'll take with another, because again, any changes do need to be paid for.
Yeah.
But yeah,
So,
the easiest would be to be the changing the thresholds because they've just been in place for so long.
I think that's almost inevitable. I wouldn't be at all surprised if in a pre-election budget the 325,000 is just pushed up a little bit. As you say, inheritance tax collects what, £7 billion a year, which of course is a lot of money. But in budgetary terms, of the 800 billion that's collected in taxes, generally it's a very small amount. It's significantly less than income tax, national insurance, and VAT, which are the big areas where tax is collected. Okay, what we'll do, well, I might come back to you, Michelle, on one or two other bits, but I'm just going to give David a bit of airtime. So David, one of our financial planners. So where should we start with you? So I'm getting back to my my script. So the pension changes. So pension changes that were introduced back in April 2023, which frankly, felt like a breath of fresh air. That it removed a few bits of the system that weren't working well. It meant that this great concern around, particularly people working in the medical profession who were effectively having to pay pension charges just for turning up to work. So there were a lot of quite generous measures introduced there, but those measures did predominantly benefit those higher earners. I guess what's your view of the current system, whether it's fit for purpose, what the Conservatives might do on the way into an election if they have another budget, and what Labour might do if they come into power?
No, thanks, Tim. So I think the change was welcome. I think certainly by higher earners, by those in the NHS and other sort of people in defined benefit schemes, because there was an unintended consequence of the restriction of the amounts that we paid into pensions, which is that people were, as you say, sort of effectively being taxed for turning up for work because of the way that the calculations were done on what was conceived to be the pension contribution. It was never actually made as a pension contribution; it was an accrual. So the increase to £60,000 for the annual allowance that can be paid into pensions, very welcome. Also, the restriction on the sort of the tapering, so that those who are earning over £200,000 get the full £60,000. There's a bit of tapering that happens after that, but even the highest earners can still contribute up to £10,000 into a pension. The other thing that was very good was the abolition in sort of two stages of the lifetime allowance. So the first stage one was to reduce the lifetime allowance charge. So the lifetime allowance is the restriction on how much you can have in your pension before you start paying more tax on it at the point that you come to access it, or when you pass it on as a death benefit. So the announcement to abolish the lifetime allowance is in the current tax year, the lifetime allowance has been reduced to zero. From the 6th of April onwards, we enter a new regime, a much more complicated or nuanced regime, where although the lifetime allowance has been abolished, it's been replaced by two other acronyms. And in our world, we love our acronyms. So we now have the lump sum allowance, which is the amount of tax-free cash you can take out of your pension. Excuse me, and the lump sum and death benefit allowance, which is the amount that you can leave to the next generation without there being an additional tax charge. So current rules, pensions are exempt from inheritance tax, and up to the age of 75, if you die with pension benefits, they can pass on to the next generation with no tax to pay, up to an amount. So the new regime, I would say it's unbelievably nuanced and complicated. There's 100 pages of legislation gone into how the current regime is. So the idea that when Jeremy Hunt stood up in 2023 and said he's abolishing the lifetime allowance, and everyone cheered, and then Rachel Reeves stood up and said we're going to abolish all of that. The idea that you can just hit undo is just, that's not going to happen. I think it is an incredibly complicated piece of legislation that's been brought in. It's done over two finance acts, really, really complicated. And I think a lot of the motivation around the changes was around the unintended consequences of people in the NHS, consultants, and the senior doctors and so on, retiring because they have this very, iniquitous sort of like tax treatment of, effectively something they had no control over. So initially, Labour did say that there would be some kind of carve out for people that were, working in certain professions, and I think the NHS was certainly what they had in mind for that. But they've rode back on that, more recently. So yeah, I think it's. I mean, basically, I think it's an extremely sort of complicated area. I think it would take there would be have to be some form of transitional protections for people, because, for example, one of the one of the former sort of like impacts of the lifetime allowance was that you could have a provisional protection, which meant that you could protect a higher lump sum than the sort of standard lump sum that you could have. There was five different flavors of that, but effectively they gave you a protected tax-free lump sum, but you couldn't then contribute into a pension. So that was removed. That's in black and white. HMRC have totally confirmed that if you do have a form of provisional protection, you can now contribute into a pension, not lose that protection, and receive tax relief. And we've been having lots of conversations with clients about whether or not to do that. Our view is don't do anything until we've seen the legislation. The legislation's now out, so we now have confidence to advise clients to who have a form of provisional protection to contribute. Now, if Labour just reversed everything, then those people, the fear is that those people might then suddenly find themselves in a situation where they've lost a provisional protection. So I think that would have to be taken into consideration. And I don't imagine a situation where any future government would penalise people for doing something completely legitimate, that was sanctioned by legislation. So I see the potential for quite a lot of consulting if Labour were to come in and were to decide to reform the new arrangements. But personally, I can't see that coming in until maybe 26-27 tax year.
I mean, it just in listening to that, David, and I sort of live in this world alongside you. It sits in the sort of very complicated area, and pensions, which affect almost everybody in the country who's had some working life or the ability to save, is that they touch the pension regime in one way or another. It's mind-bogglingly complicated. So I mean, some simplification is needed, but it's such a spider's web of legislation. If you start pulling on one string, you've got to then unravel these hundreds, if not probably stretches the entire pension legislation to thousands of pages of legislation. So following a change of government, the lifetime allowance, I think the general view seems to be that Labour would reinstate it, but also accepting that it will be quite a difficult thing for them to do and wouldn't happen immediately, and there'll be a whole ton of extra ifs and buts and transitional rules that would go with it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I mean, look, there are sort of simple things that that a future government could do, and I think that the target here is something like 45 or 47 billion pounds worth of tax relief, which is given to pensions. So that's what that's what any future government or any is going to want to sort of like try and claw back, because every pound in tax relief could be spent on schools and hospitals. So it's on the one hand, you have to accept where we are as a country, which is that we have a a very high tax burden, but at the same situation we do have services to provide. So I sort of sit through the lens of what's possible. So I mean, I think some form of restriction on the lifetime allowance or the amount of death benefit that could be passed on is a possibility. I think restrictions on the amount of tax relief that could be given. Something's been suggested, several years ago is, at the moment you can get tax relief up to 45%, which is your marginal rate, and through other sort of forms of tax planning by reducing your income through pension contributions below £100,000, the effective tax relief rate is 60%, because of the complex way the income tax code works at the moment. So having some kind of like a flat rate restriction on how much tax relief you get and the way it's calculated, rather like you have with VCTs and EISs, where you just get a 30% tax reduction rather than any other form of that potentially would be a more fruitful way of attacking that. I
mean, the going back to Conservatives stealing the Labour Party's thunder by abolishing the non-dom regime, that deprived Labour of 4 billion or so of their spare cash to spend on other things. So they need to look elsewhere. pensions to me are the obvious place. You know, like you say, it's 45-50 billion of tax relief given away every year. Then you need to nibble into that a little bit to make their numbers start to work again. So I think it's an obvious way. Now, David, I know the question that you don't enjoy, but you know, tax-free cash. I think every budget, you and I have stood next to the coffee machine in the office and said, "Look, is it going? What's happening? Should all our clients pull their tax-free cash out today?" Is it with an election looming and Labour needing to look down the back of the sofa for some spare cash? Has the view changed? Is tax-free cash more at risk now than it's been in the last 50 years?
That's a good question. So okay, so yeah, we have debated this many times. I mean, so my personal view is that you should never do anything in advance of a potential change if you don't know what the change is, when the change might happen, etc. So I would strongly recommend that no one does anything they weren't about to do anyway. I mean, there are. I mean, the most obvious thing about taking out your tax-free cash is that all of the time that your money is in a pension is exempt from inheritance tax. It can potentially pass on to your next generation without any tax to pay. It can grow tax-free. It's the pension is one of the best places to keep wealth. From a generational tax planning point of view, and also from a personal income planning point of view. So should you take out your money from that very tax privileged environment and place it so it can be taxed under inheritance tax, capital gains tax, income tax, etc., etc. Well, I mean, I would argue that that's almost certainly not the right thing to do. Even if there were a potential restriction on tax-free cash, we would know about it well in advance, and we could plan and organise people's finances around that. So, for anyone sort of thinking about doing it, I would urge them to rethink and maybe give one of our people a call so that we can chat through, what might be a better solution for you.
It's really an unsatisfactory world we live in, isn't it? Because people have relied on that tax-free cash to fund retirement, and if the rules change with not much notice, then retirement plans change. But we always have this on the way into an election, a great deal of uncertainty. Okay, well, look, I'm going to just pick up capital gains with you as well, David. I know sort of from a financial planning point of view, Michelle might have some views from her tax advisory point of view. So, capital gains, various papers have been put out by the Office of Tax Simplification, and various comments have been made in the Commons about capital gains. I mean, at the moment, it's pretty low, I suppose. In the UK, we've got 20% on most assets, 28% on residential property, and some other weird and wonderful things. What's your view? Do you think under again a conservative budget pre-election is unlikely to put the capital gains tax rate up, as they've been criticised for the highest tax burden in 70 years? Under a Labour government, if there's a change of government, do you think capital gains is in the spotlight?
Well, I mean, I think it has to be. I mean, as you said, I mean, there's we need to sort of fund the services, and we are we do have a very high tax burden. I mean, capital gains tax, because relatively few people pay it. It's an easier target, I guess, than some of the other things. I mean, the Conservative government have really stripped away a lot of the exemptions. You could, for a married couple or a civil partnership, you could have 12,300 each. You can move assets between each other. So there's all sorts of ways that you could plan around reducing your capital gains tax liability, which have been whittled away now from from the next tax year onwards. The allowance is reduced to £3,000. Under the current government. If Labour were to come in, or if we were to see a reform of capital gains tax, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when capital gains tax was unified with income tax, so you were paying rates of 20 and 40%. That could happen. How many people it would impact? Some. What planning can be done to circumvent that? Well, certainly what we've been talking to our clients about for the last couple of years, when the reforms have happened, is to make use of all the things that are still there. So you've got ISA allowances, potentially that increasing from 20 to 25% if they can work out how to do the £5,000 UK ISA top up bit. Structuring your investment slightly differently. So if you invest in a fund rather than a series of funds, so multi-asset funds, the way those are taxed, can have some benefits for you.
So
I think actively managing the gains as well, tax policy.
For many years, people have just relied on the annual exemptions. I mean, they don't really pay any capital gains unless they've got more than a couple of £100,000 invested. So that's all going to change. I mean, just to be clear, Rachel Reeves has said no plans to introduce or increase capital gains tax, but I think that's probably an assurance given for maybe the first year of a new government. I think very soon they're going to realise they've got to raise some money. One of the questions that's come in is talking around, would there be any, extra incentives for entrepreneurs? So, if there was an increase in the headline rate of capital gains, I imagine in the same breath they'll do something that will say, well, and for entrepreneurs, the £1 million limit to business asset disposal relief at the moment, where entrepreneurs can pay just 10% tax. There's a chance that will be ticked up. I mean, in years gone by, it was as high as £10 million. And in fact, in the days of taper relief, it was unlimited. So an increase in the headline rate of capital gains tax with a little bit of a giveaway for entrepreneurs, maybe taking that 1 million limit to 2 million, I can see will be a way of spinning that. We've also got an announced Labour policy as they will attack the private equity regime and people who work in the private equity market who have carried interest, which Labour would view as just an employment bonus that's taxed to capital gains. They've said they'll reform that, so they'll tax something that looks like an employment bonus, subject to income tax. So they'll raise a bit of money there. Now, in the last few minutes, so thank you for that, David. I'm going to appoint each of you as Chancellor of the Exchequer for just a minute or two, and ask, with a free hand, what would you do? So I'm going to start with you, Michelle, because I'm not sure I warned you of this, Donald, so you've got a minute to think about it. So Michelle, with a free hand, you've now got command of the Treasury. What will you be doing to make life better for the population of the UK?
Oh, okay. Anyone who knows me will know I'll be talking about the high income child benefit charge or tax-free childcare, because if you've got an hour, I will talk to you about it, but I'll try and keep this very brief. It's essentially, it's a really unfair system at the moment. It's a bit of a cliff edge. You've got the situation where you can have two working parents earning a certain amount, and actually one working parent earning less than the combined, and actually lose all their child benefit. Obviously, the budget did give some transitional provisions where it's going to be reform in 2 years' time, but there's still so much that can be done. And also, there's a cliff edge where people earn £100,000 that they lose quite a lot of their tax-free childcare. And again, that's just and it's literally, you can earn 99,199 and get it, earn £2 more, you lose it all. So it is, that's what I would reform, sort of very briefly.
It does feel like a broken system. Rachel Reeves, I think, said earlier this week that she wouldn't adopt the Conservative Party plans on tax-free childcare, which is actually quite a bold statement because the giveaway is huge, but they're giving away
all the additional
without
hours, you mean? Yeah.
So
again, that's very difficult, because I think what's not been thought about there, it's kind of been, it's been announced, and actually how that would actually be delivered. I think it's really great in principle, so you can kind of see where that's coming from, I think.
I would think when we see Labour's manifesto, there'll be something around childcare. David, you're Chancellor now for just a minute, probably just a minute.
Okay, so I mean, pension simplification would be great, but that's given me a career, so I'm not voting for that. I mean, probably one iniquity that that I've noticed is that if you have a couple each earning £70,000, the tax treatment is very different to if one of them's earning 140. So something around that, I think would help. I know that Jeremy Hunt has talked about sort of like some kind of equalisation of tax treatment, but that's something. I don't think it would necessarily save a huge amount of tax, but it will probably need to be funded somewhere. But
yeah, you're suggesting we become more American. Americans get to file jointly if they're a married couple, so maybe we will become more American. And Donald, you're on mute just there for a second. Just closing remarks on what you would do to the employment environment. What would you do to make life better for everybody?
I think I'd probably try. I probably would go along with some of the things that I've seen earlier in the Green Paper, in particular, sort of perhaps giving the single enforcement body some more teeth, and giving it the power to prosecute. Because at the moment, I don't think that's the case. You get a name and shame list, but I'm not really sure how effective that's been. Because whenever I've mentioned it to clients, they haven't known it's existed. So perhaps having an enforcement body with more teeth would be useful, and it might take some of the pressure off tribunals if those can be sorted out in other ways. And I think I probably would, rather than having codes of practice, which are kind of guidelines more than anything else, I probably would move to kind of ban, say, things like firing and rehiring, except in certain circumstances. I think I probably wouldn't go as far as is being suggested here. I might say have an exception where if it's fundamental to the survival of the business, you can use it, but only in those circumstances. You can't just use it to push people onto worse terms.
Well, there we go. So the views. We're just at our 45 minutes. So sorry to cut off you there. All I'll do. We like to wrap up on time, as I'm sure everyone has a working day to get to. Having cut across, I think it's a brilliant topic, and those who know me, I love talking about the crystal ball gazing, what may happen in the future. So we could have gone on for much longer on this. It's really fascinating. And when we get a Labour manifesto, we may even rerun this to sort of look at some of the policies in more detail. It remains to thank our panelists. So thank you, David. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Donal. Fascinating topics. Thank you, all the attendees and the questions that were asked. As I said earlier, we'll be circulating a recording if anybody wants to share this with colleagues. There'll be some notes sent round, so you've got something to refer to, which might be interesting, and you'll also get a feedback form, and we're pathetically grateful if you would fill it out. Let us know what you thought, if there's any topics you'd like us to cover in the future. The next session covers the research and development tax relief regime, so more details of that will follow, and we hope to see you on future sessions. Many thanks.